passage from the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verses 1 through 17. Genesis 15, 1 through 17. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Elzar of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but his son, coming from your own body, will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. I give you this land to take possession of. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them into two, and arranged the halves opposite of each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nations they serve as slaves, and afterwards you will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace, and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephites, Amorites, Canaanites, Gishites, and Jebusites. There's an old story about a man who called a furnace repair place to have his furnace looked at. And he said to the receptionist, My wife's at home, but I'll need you to wait until I can get off work to come home to meet the repairman. And the receptionist said, Oh, is your wife uncomfortable with someone else being in the house when you're not there? And I said, No, nothing like that. I'll need to show the repairman how to work the thermostat. The receptionist kind of laughed and said, Well, our repairmen are all very well trained. They know how to run pretty much any kind of thermostat. The man said, You don't understand. The thermostat in my hallway is a dummy. It's just there for my wife to play with. I'm the only one who knows where the real one is. Have you ever felt like that in life? Have you ever felt like somebody hid the real thermostat? Have you ever felt in life like you're really trying to do everything right, but nothing changes? You beat your head against the wall, you, symbolically speaking, turn the thermostat up to the top temperature, but the temperature doesn't change. I know what that's like. I know what it's like to feel like you're trying to do the right thing, but all your plans just seem to fall apart all at once. I know it's like when you take every turn and it always seems to lead to another dead end. I think Abram knew what that was like as well. And as Christians, this can be particularly frustrating for us because we believe in a God who watches over us. In the book of Romans, Paul came out and said, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. This is one of the most important promises in the Bible. But what about the times when it doesn't seem like things are working for the good? What about those times in life where it feels like everything is just turning to dust. I think Abram knew what that was like. He knew what it felt like to have everything fall apart on him. And looking at Abram's life, I think we can take some advice for our lives today. As we pick up the story today, Abram was probably feeling a little depressed. He was trying to follow God. The Lord had called him to go to this new land, and Abram had went. Now he was living in the land, but he was still a foreigner. He didn't own any of the land. He didn't really know anybody there. The only family that had come with him was Lot, and the two of them had just parted ways. So now it was just Abram and his wife. And they were probably feeling isolated, alone. In the midst of his depression, God came to Abram. I would highlight this because it is unusual. Mostly we go to God. The Lord invites us into his presence, and we go to the Lord. But this time, God went to Abram. And as Abram was feeling alone and depressed, God made a promise to Abram. He said to Abram, "Do not fear. I am your shield, your very great reward." That's what God said. God did not say, "I have a reward in store for you." He didn't say, "I will give you a reward." He said, "I am your reward." Still true for us today. God is our reward. We need to know the Lord. That's been hardwired into our DNA. One of the very few things that's constant across every civilization, throughout all time in the entire world, is there is always a search for God. We need to know our Creator. And God says the reward for those who seek him is that we will find him. God is the reward. A relationship with him and knowing him is the reward. The hope and peace and life that come from knowing him is the reward. And that means we need to start our lives by aligning our goals with God's reward. Because we don't serve for an earthly reward. We're not seeking fame and money. Those are the rewards of this world. They're not the rewards we seek in God, and they're not a reward he offers. I know it can be hard to get past that mindset. In 2012, UCLA did a study of 10 to 12-year-olds to discover what their goals in life were. And they found the number one aspiration for their study group was to be famous. Not famous for anything, just to be famous. More than achievement or financial success or serving their community, they wanted to be well known, famous people. I find that particularly interesting because research has also found repeatedly that notoriety, being famous, and poor mental health go together. People who are famous, no matter why they're famous, tend to be more depressed, less hopeful, and less peaceful than the general population. I think that God does not offer the rewards of this world because they don't create the kind of lives that God desires. God is the reward. We don't serve him for the fame, for the money, for the things of this world. Our God is our reward. Well, having said this to Abram, Abram then brings up the heart of the issue he's having. He said to God, "God, what can you give me? No matter what you give me, I remain childless. The man who will inherit my estate is Elsazar of Damascus." There was a tradition at the time that said if the man had no heir, he could choose a servant who would inherit his estate when he died. God had promised that Abram would have children. In fact, he promised that entire nations would be descended from Abram. But a lot of time had passed since then. Years had gone by, and still Abram remained childless. Abram had to be banging his head against the wall. He had to be wondering what he was doing wrong. Why was God's promise not being fulfilled? Abram was trying to serve the Lord. He thought he was doing what is right. He even had this promise from God, but it wasn't happening. And now, it was too late. Abram was about 70 when this passage took place. His wife wasn't much younger. They understood that the time for bearing children had passed. Had they misunderstood God's promise? Did God fail to follow through? In response to this concern, first God restated his promise to Abram. He had Abram go out and look at a night sky. Remember, this is before a couple hundred years of man-made pollution and all the electric lights that dim the stars. And look up at a starry sky. And he said, count the stars if you can. That's what your children will be like, more than anyone could ever count. But then God went a step farther than this. God reaffirmed the covenant with Abram. I talked about covenants a few weeks ago. A covenant is like a contract, except it's unconditional. Both sides agree to follow through no matter what the other person does. An interesting note of grammar, because I know everyone's always fascinated with grammar lessons. Still going to tell you. In the ancient world, they did not make a covenant. They cut a covenant. Have you ever heard someone cutting a deal? It's from this old phrase of cutting a covenant. And there's a reason they call it cutting a covenant. If a great emperor conquered another kingdom, he would cut a covenant with the defeated king. That is, the defeated king would have to get an animal, like, say, a bull, and he would physically cut the animal in half. And he'd put the two pieces on the ground, and the defeated king would then make a promise to the conquering emperor. He promised to send a certain amount of gold every year, or provide soldiers for the army, or something like that. And then he would walk in between the two cut pieces of animal. It would say something like, if I ever break this covenant, may I be cut in half like this animal. Well, God cut a covenant with Abram. He had Abram get a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and he had Abram cut those animals in half. And anyone in the ancient world who read this would immediately understand what was going on. They would immediately see this as a covenant, and they would know what was coming next. Abram was going to walk in between these two animals. God, the great king, was establishing his power and declaring Abram's loyalty to him. Then God did something unexpected. God did something that in the ancient world no one would have seen coming. God walked in between the animals. God's presence, symbolized by a smoking fire pot, appeared and traveled in between the pieces of these animals. And God said, I am making this covenant with you. I will fulfill it. In the midst of Abram's depression, God made an unforgettable statement. And the statement is this: God's promises are unbreakable. That's still the promise for us today. God's promises are unbreakable. I know it doesn't always feel that way. Sometimes it feels as if God is not following through. Faith is trusting God's promises regardless of how we feel at any given moment. I know we live in a world that says go with your guts, but I think most of us understand that how we feel at any given moment isn't always reliable. Our feelings change with a whim, with the sunlight coming through the clouds, with how much sleep we got last night. Whatever we feel at any given moment, God's promises are unbreakable. Now, there can be a variety of reasons why we feel as if God's promises aren't being fulfilled. Perhaps the timing's not right. We want what we want, and we want it now. I'm sure Abram felt that way. God made this promise that he would have a child. Why hadn't it happened yet? Abram wanted it now. Sometimes God's timing isn't our timing. That God has a plan and he has a schedule. And in response to Abram's fear, God confirmed his covenant. He promised on his time he would fulfill his promise. Sometimes God's interests aren't our interests. God has promised that all things work together for the good of those who love him. Sometimes what we want and what's good in God's plan are not the same thing. God calls us to trust him, to trust that he really does have a plan that is good for us. Even when it doesn't feel like that, even when what we want isn't what God wants. God calls us to trust that he has a good plan because his promises are unbreakable. Sometimes it's just not about us. This is one of the most difficult lessons I had to accept in my walk with Christ. Sometimes it's not about us. It's not about me. When we give our lives to God, it means that he uses us in ways that aren't really about us. It's about his kingdom. It's about the lives of other people that we enter into, no matter how long or short we're in their life. It's about his plan to bring all things together for the good. That's bigger than me. God's promises are unbreakable. But sometimes when I give my life to him, it means that he's going to use me in a way that's simply not about me. Yet he still promises that all things work for the good of those who love him. And his promises are unbreakable. One more thing I want to say to close out today's sermon. So the last little bit in this passage, we almost skip over because it's very small, but it may be the most important part of the passage. In verse 6, it says, Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. In the New Testament, Paul picked up on this idea to explain how we are saved in Jesus Christ. When we think about great guys, the heroes of the faith, Abram's got to be right near the top. Right? He's one of the great heroes of the Old Testament. And we wonder why he was so great. I think most people would say because Abram did these amazing things. In Paul's day, people would point out that Abram was willing to sacrifice his son, Isaac. After having this promise of a son, having waited so long for that promise to be fulfilled, God then asked Abram to sacrifice Isaac on an altar. Now, we know this was a demonstration of Abram's faith and that God organized things so the boy would never actually be harmed, but it was still a great sign of Abram's faith and sacrifice and trust in the Lord. And a lot of people would say that's why Abram was righteous, because of these things he did. Paul had a different reason. He pointed to this passage, and this is before Abram had done anything great. This is before Isaac was even born. Yet already God has called Abram righteous. We're told Abram believed God and was credited to him as righteousness. The best way I can think of describing something that's credited in our world is a credit card. If I go to Walmart and I go to buy something, I give the cashier my credit card. Now, I'm not giving them any money. I might not have the money at that moment, but I still get to buy the stuff. They treat that credit card as if it is money. In the same way, God credits our faith as righteousness. He treats faith as if it is righteousness. At this point in the story, Abram had not done anything that good. He had not been righteous. Yet he believed God, and God treated that faith as if it were righteousness. Abram and God both knew he wasn't actually righteous, but he trusted the Lord. And so they treated that faith as righteousness. And then Paul turns to us today and says, how are we saved? How do we become righteous? And the Apostle Paul said it's the same way that Abraham did. Not because we are such great people. And I think that's what most people would say. If you want to know how I am saved, it's because I'm a good guy. You know, I don't murder, I don't rob banks, I don't spit my gum out on the sidewalk for people to step on. I recycle. I'm a good person. That's how I'm saved. The Apostle Paul said that's not because of what we do. That we can't be good enough to be saved on our own. We can't be righteous by our own actions. If anything, what we do is the problem, not the solution. That we haven't always done what is right. The law wasn't given to make us good, and no law can save us.
Instead, Paul wrote that we are saved the same way Abraham was saved. We are saved by faith. When we put our faith in God, God credits that faith as righteousness. And this is our faith. Our faith is that Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, has come to earth. He's lived life as a man. He's lived a sinless life that we could not live, and he has died on the cross for our sins. On the third day, he rose from the dead, victorious over sin and death. And when we put our faith in him, God credits that faith as righteousness. It's not because what we have done. It's not that we are such great people, but that we have trusted God, and he credits that faith as righteousness. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that what we do doesn't matter. I'm not saying that we should just ignore godly living, because God does desire good living from us. He desires for us to seek him and to serve him. But that's not what saves us. We're not saved because we are such great people. God has credited our faith as righteousness. In a moment, we're going to stand for invitation. And as we stand and sing, if you need that righteousness, if you need a faith credited as righteousness, if you're tired of trying to be good enough on your own, you need a faith that is credited as righteousness, you have an opportunity. I ask you'll stand with me now for invitation hymn, which is Wider Than So, number 436, and we'll sing just the first verse.